Good morning, Grace Point family. I'm excited to talk this morning with you about the physical evidence of the resurrection. We're going to look at some evidence from the time period, some non-Christian writers, and I hope this will be helpful to you this morning. So this morning we're focusing on physical evidence, and first that we need to, if we're talking about the resurrection, we need to look at the fact that Jesus died. Did he really die? And we're going to be covering a couple of the alternative theories later. So if it comes to mind, it's like, I heard about this theory, or what about that theory? How does all that blend in? We will cover that a little bit later in the series. But I want to look at a couple different noted historians and even skeptics. So first we have Tacitus. He's referring to the crucifixion as the extreme penalty. And he writes in a book called the Annals. He seemed to have started writing it prior to 116 AD, but certainly 116 AD, we know he was writing the book. So that would have been 80 years after the crucifixion. It says, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. So here's Tacitus, not a Christian, not a believer, not a follower of Jesus, but acknowledging within a 100-year time frame that Jesus, or Christ, or Christus as they call him here, died at the hands of the Romans under Pontius Pilate by crucifixion. We also have another writer, a Greek writer named Lucian. He lived between 125 and 180 AD, so we're not sure exactly when this statement was written, probably sometime sort of the middle or the end of that. But he says, the Christians, worship of man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and who was crucified on that account. So here is a Greek writer, Lucian, stating that Jesus was crucified and that he was also physically crucified, also the founder of it. This is a current critic, John Crossan, writes that Jesus' death by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate is as sure as anything historical can ever be. So this is not a Christian, this is not a follower of Jesus, but he's saying the death of Jesus on the cross is as confident as we can be about anything historically. We also see an atheist, Ludemann writes, Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. So here, again, people who are not necessarily followers of Jesus, but saying that the physical death of Jesus by crucifixion is incontrovertible. Now, why is this important? Well, certainly, if you're going to claim someone rose from the dead, they actually had to have died first. So this is why these pieces are important for us to look at, is that both scholars from that time period or historians from that time period and scholars today who have very little to gain by stating that Jesus rose from the dead stated that Jesus physically died. Another piece that we see is public figures were involved in this. Joseph and Nicodemus, they were both involved in the burial of Jesus. The problem with that is that the burial of Jesus made Jesus' burial a public scene. If it was just the disciples, they weren't extremely well known. We even see that Peter's denial of Jesus. You probably might be able to hear my dog whining in the background. I apologize. But Jesus' death was something that was a public scene, but his followers weren't extremely well known. People came up to Peter 2 or 3 times and say, "Hey, weren't you the guy that was with Jesus?" And so if they had handled the burial of Jesus, or some ladies that had followed him largely from Galilee, certainly that could have gone under the radar. But you have Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, both men of prominence, men of wealth. Even Nicodemus was involved in the council. And so you have some key figures that when they publicly go to Pilate, these would have not been unknown people in unknown houses. People would know where they lived, where they worked, where they worshipped. And so their inclusion in the burial makes the burial an identifiable event, that they were involved in the burial of Jesus and everybody knew who they were and where they were involved. It meant also that afterwards people would go talk to them and follow up with them, versus a couple random Galileans that were there. No, these are people that someone could go and ask follow-up questions of. So their public figures make this a lot harder to fake. Let's see that Rome was involved in this. Now, when Jesus was buried, the Pharisees said, hey, they went to Pilate and they said, look, the disciples of Jesus, they might steal the body and claim that he rose from the dead. They understood how serious a claim of resurrection could be to their own position and their own power. And so they said, hey, we want to secure this. And so they put a seal on the tomb. Now, when Rome sealed something, it was their stamp across that, or it was probably a wax kind of seal, meant that if you broke that seal and you weren't authorized to do that, you could be put to death by this. And so we see that the tomb of Jesus was sealed, but that the seal was broken. And then the Roman guards that were placed in front of the tomb, they also disappeared. Now, for a Roman guard to leave his post, or flee from his post, or deliberately desert his post, would have been an offense that execution would have been the penalty of. This was no small piece. For them to let a prisoner escape, even, I guess, a dead prisoner in this case, but would have been something punishable by death. So certainly if anyone was motivated to make sure that that body stayed in the tomb, it would have been these Roman soldiers. And yet, the body disappears. We also see the issue of a big rock. We think of, rocks moved there. Most likely this stone that would have been rolled in front of the grave was between 1.5 to 2 tons. We know that based on some of the other graves of similar size that were found in the area. And this is particularly difficult because it was guarded. So if you're going to say, well, the body of Jesus was stolen, most people say it was the women that followed Jesus that kind of went and initially took the body. The disciples, even in their own accounts, didn't believe that Jesus was going to rise from the dead. And so you have, the theory is a couple women going at night, sneaking past the guard of Roman soldiers, breaking the seal of Rome upon penalty of death, and then also rolling this 1.5 or 2 ton stone back uphill out of the way of the grave. This is certainly a huge physical obstacle to accomplishing a fake resurrection. We also have the problem, though, of the empty tomb. Is that the empty tomb is proclaimed in Jerusalem immediately after death. Now, this isn't a story where the empty tomb fable originates 1,000 miles away, or 5,000 miles away, or 500 years later. That would have been something easy to fake and difficult to prove. But we see the empty tomb story or account originates in Jerusalem, the place where he was killed and buried, immediately after his death. This leaves no time for fable. This leaves a lot of room for investigation. And everybody was proudly proclaiming the tomb is empty. In fact, the Jewish leaders themselves didn't contest the empty tomb. They said in Matthew 20, it says, while they were going, behold, some of the guard went to the city and they told the chief priests all that had taken place. So these soldiers go back into they were placed, they're Roman soldiers, but they're placed there by the Jewish leaders. And so they go back into the city and they're going to recount that the earthquake happened, the stones rolled away, the tomb is empty. And it says, and when they'd assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers. And they said, tell people, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were sleeping, or while we were asleep. Now, the master plan of the elders and the chief priests was to say, okay, you guys, how about you tell everyone that you kind of fell asleep? And while you were sleeping, the disciples managed to come and roll 1.5 ton stone silently away from the grave and carry out a body without you ever waking up, with all of you being asleep. By the way, yes, the penalty was death for doing so. And it says, and if it comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and we will keep you out of trouble. And so they took the money and they did as they were directed, and this story has been spread among the Jewish people to this day. Now, if the tomb was not empty, this is the worst story to come up with. If the body was still in the tomb, if Jesus' body was there, it would have been so much easier for them to say, go check it out. The tomb where we buried him, it's still there, it's still sealed, and it's still guarded. Like, that's the easy explanation to all of this. But they didn't do that. In fact, their whole story revolves around the fact that the tomb is empty, and now they're trying to explain why the tomb is empty. So even the way they did it, they acknowledge the resurrection or the empty tomb. Also, the issue is that there's no veneration of the bones. It was extremely common in the first century. So when someone died who was of note or prominence or value, that there was often a shrine, a veneration put to the bones. We know about the burial of the bones of Abraham and the bones of Joseph and the bones of David. And this would have been very common for the day. And so if the location of the body of Jesus was known, certainly the veneration most likely would have occurred. That it would have been so natural and so obvious for there to have been a location, even if it started off secret location, for Christians to go and honor the body of Jesus. Now we have pieces of the cross and we have other accoutrements to the crucifixion and the resurrection, but there's no bones of Jesus that are venerated. And particularly early on, this most likely would have been the case. We also see that the grave clothes remain. Now this is highly unusual for stealing a body, particularly a body that had been destroyed, a body that had been wrecked and ravaged with the effects of crucifixion, whipping, mutilation. Unwrapping that body to leave the cloths there would have been highly unusual. In fact, there would have been no reason to do it, particularly when you're trying to sneak the body out. You take the body, the wrappings, and everything, and you get out of there. And yet, unlike what we would have expected for a robbery, the grave clothes remain. We also have multiple witnesses of Jesus being resurrected. This is also a problem because if you saw someone physically die, and everyone agrees that Jesus died, when you have physical people who are alive saying, hey, I saw Jesus, that's a real problem. And it's not just one or two. It's not just Jesus' closest, most fervent followers that said they saw Jesus alive, but even up to 500 people. The other problem is you also have what we call hostile witnesses, or witnesses that don't have anything to gain by stating that Jesus was alive. One we have is Saul of Tarsus, who we later know as Paul. He was a rabbi. He was early and aggressive in the persecution of the church. He did everything he could to put down the name of Jesus and to stamp that out. And then what happens? Well, he changes sides. And he takes a beating for doing so. In fact, it ends up costing him his own life to actually claim that he saw Jesus resurrected. We also see Jesus' siblings. Throughout his lifetime, every time we see them in the Gospels, I think Jesus is crazy. I think he's mad. They're trying to take him back home. And then all of a sudden, they go from saying, we don't believe, we're not sure this happened, to now being leaders in the early church, saying that they saw the resurrected Jesus. And that when Paul actually goes and checks his story, he's going to check the story with James, saying, hey, here's what I saw. Correct me if I'm wrong. And so we have hostile witnesses, or witnesses who had nothing to gain by saying they saw Jesus risen from the dead. This is the physical evidence that we've looked at, is that Jesus died. Early historians, non-Christian historians, agree and confirm this piece. And then we saw that the tomb is empty, that there's even those who had the most to gain by having the tomb filled were saying, nope, the tomb is empty, but here's why. And then it seems that even those that would be least likely to want to see Jesus resurrected from the dead, Jesus' siblings, Saul of Tarsus, that they said, hey, we too see Jesus arisen. So the physical evidence is strong that almost no one disagrees with the fact that Jesus physically died on the cross. This is essential because in order for him to have risen from the grave and risen from the dead, we have to say he physically died. His heart stopped beating. He stopped breathing into his lungs. And then he was buried in a tomb. And then not only was he buried, but that his body was missing, that he was gone. And that others who originally were hostile to it said, we've seen Jesus and he's alive. So here's some of the physical evidence we looked at today. And we're going to cover some of the pieces of the changes and the effects of that a little bit later in some of these upcoming series. But I hope you take a look at the evidence and say, yes, Jesus physically died. People agree on that. And that Jesus' tomb was empty. So the question next that we're going to look at is, how is it empty? The latest followers, the multiple witnesses, they say it's empty because Jesus is alive and they saw him. Well, I'm looking forward to taking a look at that together.